May the words of my mouth and the meditation of mine heart be acceptable in Yahavah's sight. He is our strength and our Redeemer, and it is in His name, which is His authority, that we pray, praise, proclaim, project, and protect today's message of mine. All right, apparently I just spilled something on my shirt. I dropped something on my shirt. Sorry about that. Okay, well, excuse me. I guess we'll get started in a second. Sorry. We're ready to go, I thought. Okay, let's try this again. All right, let's go ahead and start this. My bad. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of mine heart be acceptable in Yahavah's sight. He is our strength and our Redeemer, and it is in His name, which is His authority, that we pray, praise, proclaim, project, and protect today's message. Aman. Hola, mi nombre es Kofi. ¿Cómo está? Bonjour, Kofi, ça va? Ni hao, namaste, Hosayana Kitabuya, Ohio, I see you, Manut, Wagwan, Kamsa, Kamsamida, Aloha, Ciao, Onson, Akwaba, Madaase, Etese, Habarigani, Jambo, Bimini Kofi, and the Fra Kukitana the Wewe. Greetings, La Yartav, Barakala Cham Yahavah, Anai, Kwavahai, Kwahelet, to Christ, Mashanamchi. Shalom, peace, family. Hello, how's everybody doing? I am Pastor Kofi, Pastor Servant of Christ, where we are always changing lives one mind at a time by being the voice of the voiceless and speaking the unspoken. We are going to jump right in because right after this, we have our project management meeting. So just quick announcements. 9 p.m. New York time, which is right at the top of the hour, we'll have our project management meeting. The link will be sent out for everybody to see on a Google Calendar invite. If you would like to attend and you don't receive emails from us as of yet, feel free to go ahead and let us know. We'll send you a text. But we'll be started with that. And there should have been some emails that you guys got with different information, including the video and schedule for the rest of this week, so that everybody be on the same page Monday through Sunday. And tomorrow we'll be on live. We'll not be on for the rest of the day, but tomorrow we'll be on the live session at 8 a.m. New York time. And then right after that, we'll do a watch party. I think it's at 12 noon New York time. And Wednesday we'll be on at 8 a.m. New York time. Watch party again at 12 noon New York time. And Elder Tamara will be on the evening. And then December 25th, we don't celebrate Christmas, but we'll be ending the series we've been doing in the Rising called Reversing the Curse, means revisiting the lie. And we will be ending that series on the lie of Christmas and explaining the lie of Christmas. And then after that, starting on Thursday, we'll be doing Q&A over and over and over again until January the 1st of 2026. All praises to the Most High. Please, sisters, don't forget that you have Friday women's meeting, Saturday night Women in Red, and December 31st will be watch night for all of us. All praises to the Most High. Then January 1st, we'll be starting our new series for hashtag We Be the Nation. So thank you all for being on again. Appreciate you so very, very much. We give our honor and praise once again to the Most High. Yahavah. We give our praise and honor to him for my wife who's on right now, the Honorable Maya. As always, you can check her out on TikTok, YouTube, or website at Bloom and Flourish, not A-N-D, the letter N, Bloom and Flourish. She is a healer, herbalist, chemist, and biologist by degree. All right, we're going to get ready to say our Bible pledge and jump right into the word. We're going to go to Galatians chapter 2. We're going to start at verse 11 where we left off finishing verse 10 on Friday. So we're going to start at verse 11. And we're going to read Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21. And since we only have about 20-something minutes left, we're going to jump right in. So thank you, everybody, once again for being on. We appreciate your presence. If you're able to rise to your feet in reverence of Yahavah's word, or however you're able to join us for the word or reverence the word of Yah, we ask that you do so at this moment in time. All right. Well, here we go. So if you're ready for the Bible pledge, you can just put your hand in the air. Just repeat after me and get ready to go through the word with us. Our Bible pledge goes as follows. This is my Bible. This is my sword. In this will I trust. For Yahashua is Lord. No sword of God shall ever be heard. For this is my Bible, and this is Yah's word. Atzam Yahavah. Amen. With Yahavah Shem, his name is authority. Let it be done unto us. Let's go ahead and read. And I'm sorry, before we get started, real quick, Let's go ahead and say shalom to everybody real quick. How you doing, Sister Carla? I'm on. All praise to the Most High. How you doing, Sister Carla? How you doing, Brother Keith? How you doing, Brother Rodney, Cole, Minister Stephen? Goed de Barach. I'm on. Bloom and Flourish, Darius, Antoine. Once again, my wife is on. Hey, how you doing, babe? Big brother Thomas, EMZ. If I miss anybody, Tahiti, I'm on. How you doing? Bill, if I miss anybody, church to my head, not to my heart. Let's get into this. So once again, we're going to be reading Galatians chapter 2. We're starting at verse 11. We're going to read verses 11 through 21. It reads as follows. It says, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James," right, which would be like before that certain person and a certain man came from James, "he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Yahavah, the other Jews, dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas was also carried away with their dissimulation." That's a very important part right there, by the way. Insomuch that Barnabas was carried away with the dissimulation. Don't miss that. That's an important piece. Because also, too, that's an important historical piece for us. Many persons don't know why Paul and Barnabas actually kind of had a little bit of issue and some things that started to pop up. This gives us a little bit of a hint at what was going on. All right. So anyway, let's keep on going. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of what we used to evangelize, once again, remember, whenever you see this term gospel or gospel, it actually means what we used to evangelize. So when I saw they did not walk uprightly according to the truth, amat, that we use for evangelism, I said unto Savas, or unto Peter, before them all, if thou being Yahavah, if thou being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou Gentiles to live as do the Jews? We who are the Jews by nature are not sinners of the Gentiles. Excuse me. We who are the Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but the faith of Yahavah, even we have believed in Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ, and not by the works of the law. For the works of the law for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. We're going to explain all this in a second, but let's just keep on reading. Verse 17, "But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? Is he the servant of sin? Does he serve others as far as sin is concerned? Elohim forbid. For if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. For I, through the law, am dead to the law, that I might live unto Elohim. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of Elohim, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not frustrate the grace of Elohim, for if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain." We've just read Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21. May Yahavah bless those who read here and especially adhere to his most holy and righteous word. You may be seated or go back to what you were doing in the presence of the Most High. Sister Deborah, how you doing? Anayah, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Welcome, though. So we're going to come into this tonight. And how you doing, Sister Snap, right? So we have to make this very clear, because once again, many persons use, and we were asked to go over the book of Galatians a few times by members of SOC, and we've been answering some stuff in Q&A, and we are headed to Galatians chapter 5, because that kind of shuts down some of the stuff, but persons, once again, don't have proper context. And once again, tonight we have to be somewhat brief so we can make sure we're ready for the project management meeting at the top of the hour. So I want to just give a quick reminder about what the purpose of the epistle or the letter, the character of Galatians, or this letter written to Galatia, what is the purpose of it? Right? What is the purpose of it? Why was it written in the first place? Well, we find out that Paul in Galatians chapter 1 has found out that the word that he had given the Galatians, right, this assembly that were Galatians, they had already turned back on the word that he had given them. He had left, and now they were doing what Israel and others had done prior, which is to take the law, learn it, so we're going to do it, and then all of a sudden, other things, other cultures, other preachers, even some of the preachers trying to, get rid of what has been presented, they had already started going away from it. So Paul makes it very clear in Galatians chapter 1, hey, you need to come back to the word. You need to start being more careful around persons. Matter of fact, I'm just going to tell you straight up, you're not ready to really argue with anybody about the word, go over the word, this and that. If I didn't teach it to you, if the persons who came with me didn't teach it to you, if we didn't show you that this is the word, right, then make sure that you don't go by this as the word, right? He then, after that, in Galatians chapter 2, as we read on Friday, Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, he makes it a point to say he took the same message that he had been given, right, by Christ himself. He took it before Peter, James, and John, and took it before them with Barnabas and Titus with him. And others were trying to spy on them when they saw this meeting come place, because he wanted to have a private meeting. Others tried to spy on this meeting and try to say things about this meeting, because they did not like the fact that the two persons that were rolling with Paul were not circumcised of the flesh, right? And this was still a huge argument in assemblies and in the nation. And so basically, they were upset, and they were like, hey, they shouldn't be speaking, doing anything. They shouldn't be coming to you. They shouldn't be before you unless they are exactly like us. They got to be circumcised physically. Right. So the goal was to get them back to the truth. And now we have other persons who are coming, but Paul specifically came. And how you doing, Brother Yahavah? Paul is coming specifically and saying, hey, I'm coming to you, Peter, James, and John. He calls them pillars. They're pillars of our community. Right. And as they come in as pillars of our community, he says, I'm going to tell you the word that Christ gave to me. You being pillars, you who having physically, literally walked with Christ. I'm going to tell you what I preach and what Christ gave me, and we're going to compare it. And you can be the barometer of it, because I know that the same Christ that lives in you lives in me. So I'm going to tell you the word, and let's see if we have an agreement. Peter, James, and John agree with the word, right? So it's not that Paul is saying a new law, a new translation, something new. But what they figure out in this meeting is that Paul has been called to preach to those who are heathens, to allow them an opportunity to come into the kingdom, and that Peter, James, and John's focus will remain on Israel. They're preaching the same message, though, so don't miss that. If Peter, James, and John are focusing on Israel, right, and making sure that Israel remains true and remains in the truth and gets back to the law of the spirit versus the law of sin, or the law of the flesh, then right, and Paul is preaching the same message, then that means Paul is not preaching a different message to the Gentile. Paul is preaching the same message, right? Now, so if the message is not two different messages, the heart of it is not different, the culture is not different, the belief system is not different, because once again, what's done with this weird thing by fanatics of Paul, especially because they're not really of Christ, but fanatics of Paul that use Paul to go ahead and say we don't have to follow anything that the law says. They use Paul to say that Paul preached something different. He was getting us away from the law. He wasn't preaching the same thing, but Peter, James, and John preached the same thing that Christ, and Christ told us to follow the law. And then he goes to them and says, hey, is what I'm preaching the same as you? Because Paul was following the law, and so were Peter, James, and John. But before Paul became converted, Paul was preaching the law of sin. Now, we always have to keep this in context, because if we're not careful, what will happen is we'll start talking about all these things and forget, wait a minute, Paul is not talking about the law when he says the law. Like, you have to recognize Romans chapter 7. Paul says the law is holy, the law is perfect, the law is without sin. He said if it wasn't for a law that said thou shalt not covet, then he wouldn't know that he shouldn't lust. But since the 10th commandment says thou shalt not covet, he says that's what allows me to know I shouldn't lust, because to lust after something is not to love it, but to lust after something is to want something that is not there to supply your needs or the needs of Yah in your life according to his riches and glory. If you lust after something, you want something for your flesh. Right. So when Paul speaks on this, it's very clear, if you know the word and you're not just picking and choosing, or you're not just letting somebody tell you read this one particular thing or read Galatians out of context. Galatians is many different letters that Paul has written. All these letters focus on law, but once again, what is Paul's focus? Paul's focus is to go and bring those who are Gentiles and allow them to come into the family. Once they become part of the family, they are no longer by themselves. They are part of the nation. They are part of the country. They are part of the kingdom. Therefore, they operate in the kingdom, and not saying we can do whatever we want. We'll just sprinkle some Jesus on it. Right? So now that we got through all that, and all they ask Paul all they say to Paul is, hey, cool, we're with you, we're in agreement. Only thing that we ask is when you go out there, please don't preach, or I'm sorry, while you're preaching and getting big and all that stuff, make sure you don't forget about the poor. That's their only request. That's their only request. Right? That's the only thing they request is, hey, please don't just go out there talking about right, doing all this stuff, but you forget that we also have to do the works. Okay, so now Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. What is Peter to be blamed for? What beef did Paul have with Peter? It says, verse 12, for before that certain time came, before that certain man came, etc., from James, right, he did eat with the Gentiles. So Peter used to have no problem eating with Gentiles. He did not eat pork or anything like that, but he didn't mind, in other words, fellowshipping and breaking bread with Gentiles. But when they were come, right, but when others showed up, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision, right, fearing them which were of the law and also born into Israel, right? He was afraid of what others would think. And remember, Paul starts off this letter heavy by making it a point to say he is an apostle appointed by men. He went to Peter, James, and John thinking to himself that they were apostles not appointed by men, but they were appointed by Christ like he was. So all of a sudden he sees Paul afraid to interact with those persons, because he's more afraid of what men would say rather than what Yah would say. How you doing, Minister Raj? That's what Paul said, right? That's what Paul says. And how you doing, Brother Dwayne? So I'm sorry. So Paul says, I'm upset with my boy. I thought he was going to be straight. I thought he was going to do what he was supposed to do. Right? We just had this talk. Everything's cool. I even know that he breaks bread with Gentiles. Why is it that when all of a sudden Jews show up, he all of a sudden forgets what this is about? That's what he said. Right? Now, verse 13, and the other Jews dissembled likewise with him. Those who were around him followed his lead. See, be careful, leadership. When we start doing what everybody else, or what we do, others will do. And if Paul could have stood up there and stood his ground and said, "Yeah, I'm fellowshipping. What of it? What's wrong with it?" But he didn't do that, did he? He was afraid of what men thought, and so he left, and everybody around him left. Verse 14. But when I saw, Paul says, when I saw that they walked not uprightly. Right? Because look, if you do one thing when nobody else is around, or at least you don't think you're being seen, but then you start doing something else when everybody changes, then you don't really believe in what you're doing. In Paul's case, you didn't really believe there was anything wrong with fellowshipping with the Gentiles, right? Because you also know that the Gentiles are going to be grafted in. You've talked to Paul about this. You guys talked about everything's supposed to be on the same page. Right? So he said that he didn't walk uprightly according to the truth of what we use to evangelize. So he said to Peter before them all, if thou being a Jew, now this is where it can get tricky, but remember, hold in your back pocket, hold in the back of your mind, that the law of the Spirit versus the law of the flesh, right? The law of the Spirit versus the law of the flesh is vital for our comprehension of what's going on. Paul is not going back on other things he's saying. Paul is not being confusing. Paul is dealing with somebody who is being out of pocket. And he says to him, hey, if thou being a Jew, if you're Judah, right, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compels the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? His question is actually not a bad question. His question is, hey, if you, when the Jews aren't around, are cool with sitting down with the Gentiles and chilling out and eating, right? And you live here and everything like that, as long as they don't disobey the law, like you're cool. As long as they don't go against Christ, you're cool. But why is it that when Jews show up, now all of a sudden you want to pretend like you don't live like this? Hey, how you doing, Sister Bet? Oh, okay. I see you. Right? Why you want to pretend that you don't live like this? Right? He says, we who are Jews by nature and not sinners of the Gentiles. He said, we are Jews. We as Jews, we who are circumcised, we who live by the law, by our nature, who we naturally are, where we come from, we are not the sinners of the Gentiles. Paul makes it separate, right? But watch this, verse 16, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but of the faith of Christ, even we have believed in Christ, that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. But if while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? Elohim forbid. Okay, so this might throw somebody for a loop. So once again, what did I tell you to keep in the back of your mind? What did I tell you to keep in your back pocket? And I got to be real quick. So talk back to me if you don't mind, if you can, or if you're able. Don't feel forced. But if you're able to talk back to me, back to me real quick. What did I just tell you? Keep in your back pocket. Because when we know the Holy Bible, that we comprehend. See, if you're just reading a letter from somebody, you don't know all the details, or you don't know how somebody thinks, right? If you look at somebody's text, but you don't know the context of their 20-year relationship, right? You could see something and be messed up, right? So Paul, remember, we just mentioned, keep in your back pocket, the law of the Spirit is different than the law of the flesh. It's the same law, but if I look through it through the Spirit, right, then it's spiritual, as it should be. It's holy. If I look at it as the law of the flesh, or as law of sin, right, then I put my flesh on it. It's not holy. Correct? So Paul is not saying, so we have to figure out then which law. See, we got to be honest about context. Hopefully I'm saying this correctly. I'm trying to speed through because we got to finish early. But prayerfully what I'm saying makes sense, right? The law of the Spirit and the law of the flesh, right? Or the law of sin, excuse me. The law of the Spirit versus the law of sin. Romans chapter 7, Romans chapter 8. The law of the Spirit and the law of sin, which is you putting your flesh on the law. Okay? Right? You guys with me? I know I'm rushing. I just want to make sure before I rush you, or before I get through this, I don't want to rush so fast that you miss what I'm saying. Right? And I still, forgive me. Maya Kayala, is it? Hopefully I'm in the ballpark. Shalom. Right? Remember, we've read that Paul said that the law is holy, the law is perfect, the law is without sin, the commandments are holy. Paul has said that there's an advantage to being circumcised. Paul has made it a point to say that you must confess, which means to confess Christ as Adam, which means you must have the same logic of him. And we know that Christ followed the law, right? But Paul also makes it a point to say that there are persons, including at one time himself, where the persons would put their flesh, what they wanted, on the law, and rather than the law being what it was in its origin, or as he says, the law of the Spirit, persons have decided to make the law what they wanted it to be, as the law of sin, putting their flesh on it. So therefore, the same law can read two different ways. Just like we talk about with the Constitution. If you don't know that there's a lowercase c citizen up until the 14th Amendment, uppercase c until the 14th Amendment, and 14th Amendment on, it's a lowercase c, you can read the same Constitution and not realize that you need to be a non-citizen national. All right, everybody. So same thing with the law is what Paul is saying, that you can read the law differently, not recognizing what it actually says, because you're sitting up there and you're putting your flesh on it. Peter has been obedient to the law, but then all of a sudden, when men who he thinks will clown him because he's sitting with Gentiles, Peter gets up and goes away. Paul says something wrong with that, bruh. Right? Either you can sit with him or you can't. But if you're okay being with them and you're okay talking to them, you're okay preaching to them, and then all of a sudden your boys show up and you're not okay, either you're not living righteous because your boys showed up, or you're not living, even you weren't living righteous in the first place, or you go stop living righteous because you're more afraid of men rather than them. Remember, Paul starts off the letter once again by saying over and over again, he's not talking about being an apostle but that men chose. He was chosen by Christ. He doesn't put men before Christ. Right? Okay. All right. I got a little bit of talking back to me, so I'm gonna just go with what we got. All right. So therefore, when we have this thought process, right, when we know what's going on, therefore, watch this. So knowing that man is not justified by the works of the law, which law is Paul talking about? Was Peter following the law of the Spirit, the law in its origin? How you doing, Nacho? Or was Peter following the law of his flesh, worried about what men had to say about him? See, because person's gonna try and turn, even though when we get to Galatians 5, it's pretty hard to be able to keep doing, to try and turn this to the law. But which law is Paul addressing? Can you guys? That's right, the law of the flesh. He's addressing the law of the flesh, or the law of sin. Peter, you worried about your flesh and you worried about what persons in the flesh will think about you and forgot what the law states. This is Paul's beef. This is Paul's issue. Right? Even look at verse 17. But if, while we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, is therefore Christ the minister of sin? So wait a minute. We're trying to be justified by Christ, but we're found sinners. Why? Because Paul, you are found to be a sinner. You're saying that you're justified by Christ, but you're worried about what men think. Do you see? You see what's going on here? Elohim forbid. He says, forbid this, Paul. Don't think like that. This is forbidden thought. Why are you worried about what men think if you're called by Christ? If Mashiach has called you, why would you worry about what anybody else would call you? That's what he's saying. Right? If we seek to be justified by Christ, we ourselves also are found sinners, right? Is therefore Christ the minister of sin? Is Christ a servant of sin? Should you serve Christ because you are sinful, or should you serve Christ because he is righteous in everything he does? Elohim forbid that thought. Verse 18, for if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. What did Paul used to do? Paul used to go around offing followers of the way. He used to think that what he thought the law was allowed him to be able to off followers of the way. But when he came into connection with who the Messiah truly was, he realized he was living by the law of his flesh, or even the tradition of his fathers, but not the law of the Spirit, or the law of the Most High. Are you with me? You got it? You see it? I just want to make sure. I know I'm rushing. We got to get ready to go. I just want to make sure, because I don't want to just spit this out and it be like, oh, whatever. This is an important part for us to get, because Galatians 3, Galatians 4 are going to make more sense now when we go into the series, when we pick this back up on Thursday and Friday. But I just want to make sure that we're in the we are on the same page, right? So Paul is making it clear. Paul is not sitting here saying never follow the law. Paul is not saying, hey, what Peter, James, and John preach is wrong. Remember, Peter, James, John, and Paul and Barnabas and Titus had a conversation, and everything went smoothly. They said they're going to preach the same thing was preached to those who are Israel, are going to be preached to those who should be grafted in, was preached to those who are Israel, who are lost, will be preached to the heathen, right? It will not change. His issue is, Peter, yo, you supposed to be the man. Working on being on the same page. Yeah, I know it's difficult, but that's why we teach about Romans so much, because Romans opens up the door. See, we can't just take Galatians one letter by itself and be like, oh, okay, when he mentions this, because then we'll say, well, then this other thing, which is what a lot of Hebrew Israelites then do, a lot of our brethren do. They go, oh, well, Paul, he was changing, he was all over the place. No, he wasn't. He's very consistent. He talks about the law of the Spirit, the law of the flesh. Whenever you're talking about Paul, you have to figure out what's the context. Is he saying that persons are sinning and using the law and sin? If you're sinning and using the law, then it's the law of sin. You put your flesh on it. But if you are doing what you're supposed to do, then it's the law of what? It's the law of the Spirit. It's correct. If you're doing what Yah says, right? In this particular instance, Peter has said, we'll agree one moment. that will preach the same thing, and what you're preaching to the Gentiles is correct, and Christ obviously has called you to do this. And then Paul turns around and sees that Peter goes back on his word, not only to Christ, but even unto Paul. And Paul's like, hold up. What happened that fast? Same thing that he talked about in Galatians chapter 1 to the persons writing the letter. Remember, he's telling the persons in Galatians things that have happened with him in his walk. And remember, he said, you guys have gotten out of pocket. We just taught you the truth. I feel like I just got on the boat, just got off the boat. Now I'm getting word saying that you guys are literally going against what we just taught. He's using examples. He uses himself as an example, how he had to change. He then talks about how he had to go up and he had to make sure that about 18 years later, after he fell off after he fell to the ground blind, about 18 years later, he finally is able to approach Peter, James, and John. They have a sit down. They make sure they compare their notes. He knows they walk with Christ. He knows that they are pillars. He says, okay, they all agree. Hey, you're preaching the truth. They say, we'll preach the truth to Israel. You preach the truth to the Gentiles. The only thing that we ask is make sure that you always consider the poor, right? Then he says, I come back to Paul. And Paul is eating. Come to find out, Paul is sitting there, and he's all like, when Israelites show up, now all of a sudden, Paul is acting like he can't eat with Gentiles anymore, and acting like we shouldn't speak to them and preach to them. And he gets up, and now he's influencing just in that meeting, even, right? He influences when he gets up and leaves the Gentiles. Now all these other Hebrews get up and leave, and so now it's really messy. He says, Paul, you're being messy. That is his issue. How you doing, double OG, triple OG? That is his issue. Paul's issue is not, right, that he's living by the law. They just compared notes. If Peter, James, and John are following Christ, and Christ lived by the law, and they're preaching the same thing, he's not preaching anything different than what they preached. That's Galatians chapter 2 as well. Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. We went over that on Friday, right? So all those things, Paul's problem is not the fact that Peter is preaching a different doctrine, or that Peter is preaching law or living by law. Paul's problem is that, hey, we just had a conversation and touched and agreed that what we're preaching is the same thing, and who we serve is the same Christ. And yet somehow, some way, you're going back on what we just promised we would do. This is his issue with Paul. And he says, so here you are saying that you live by this law, but you can't be living by the law, right? And be up to Christ, because here you are sinning. Here you are saying one thing and doing another. He says, therefore, is Christ the minister of sin? Elohim forbid. Don't think like that. Then he says in verse 18, for if I build again the things which I destroyed, I make myself a transgressor. If I build up the same thing that I used to have to be against the Gentiles being allowed an opportunity to know the truth and become what I used to be, then guess what? I make myself a transgressor. If I were to go back to that, I become I'm going to end up being what you're being right now. Stop doing that, Peter. Stop doing that, Savas. Stop doing that, Kephas. Stop doing that, Peter. Be the apostle that Christ called you to be, rather than be worried about men. Once again, Apostle Paul said it's a big deal. He said we should be listening to apostles that are moved by men before they're moved by Christ. Hey, how you doing, Sister Andrea? All praises to the Most High for your presence, right? So verse 19, after that, verse 19, he says, for I through the law am dead to the law. Wait a minute. If I through the law am dead to the law, what does that mean? What is the context? I through the law of the Spirit am dead to the law of sin. You see the context? This is why Romans, remember, when we go through Roman, we do the Roman road so much. One of the reasons we do it quite often is it helps you, because the Roman road, remember, the epistle, the book of Romans is not written in the Bible chronologically in order. It is actually written towards the end of Paul's life. They put it before all these things, because remember, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John dealing with the Messiah. The beginning of Acts deals with the Messiah, who tells us to follow the law, and we come in, and then that's when we end up, through being obedient to the through our lawful holy day of Pentecost, we end up get in a position where we receive Holy Spirit. But the rest of the book of Acts is dealing with a whole bunch of information where persons are having a tough time and they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Should everybody be circumcised? If the persons come in, should they be circumcised first? What should we do with persons who are eating unclean? This and that. They're having all these conversations. How do we baptize correctly? This and that, blah, blah. Should we break bread with them? Should we not? So those who are reading the Bible now, especially in the 66 books, you'll see the book of Romans is placed right after Acts, because the book of Romans, affectionately called the Christology, shows us the logic of Christ, or the study of Christ, and it shows us how Christ acted and what he believed. And Paul goes through this thing of showing us how the law is still important, but our responsibility is to make sure that we don't, that the law, because a lot of persons don't comprehend law. The law, because they don't comprehend nationality either, right? So nationality doesn't mean black. It doesn't mean locks. It doesn't mean this. Nationality is a nation. It's a family, right? China is not like the United States, to where you're American, this, blah, blah, this, blah, blah. I'm not saying they don't have racism, blah, blah, but hear what I'm saying. If you're in the Chinese army, you're Chinese. Okay? If you're in the Russian army, you're Russian. You're not an African American fighting for America. You're Chinese. Right? Right? If you're in Australia and you fight for the Australian army, you're Australian. Right? We have this weird stuff that's been put in stuff, and we had this weird Eurocentric stuff that's been put in place, and racism, white supremacy, and now trying to reverse it by basically becoming the same thing, but just trying to sprinkle some Yeshua on it now instead of sprinkle some Jesus on it. You have to recognize how nationality works, and if they're becoming part of a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a chosen generation, right, in a holy nation, then the nationality is important. But you have to go back, even in the so-called Old Testament. I know your Bible in English tells you that Ruth is a Moabitess constantly and consistently, but once Ruth was married in, she's already Israel. You can't marry a non-Israelite. You're not supposed to. That means that she has to become part of the nation. Once she becomes part of the nation, she's married in. This is why, even though Simeon and Levi used it for genocide, if we be honest, right? But they were not wrong to say, hey, if you're going to be with our sister, you must be circumcised. Why? Because you have to become part of the nation, and every man in Israel, right, is supposed to be circumcised. So therefore, before you try to enter into our sister and enter into our family, first things first, you must be circumcised. Being circumcised also means you must be willing to follow the law to the letter or the character. So verse 19, for I through the law am dead to the law. I through the law of the Spirit have become dead to the law of the flesh, that now I can live unto Elohim. When I follow the law, now I follow the law because I can follow Elohim directly. How you doing, Brother TJ? Sorry, I'm on another screen. I didn't see you come in. Right? So I through the law, Paul says, I through the law. Remember, what is the context in Romans? I through the law of the Spirit, the way the law is supposed to have been the whole time, with us being a nation. And the same law I checked with you guys earlier in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1 through 10. I checked with Peter, James, and John. That's what Paul is saying. I through the law, right, am dead to the law. I through the law. He didn't say I through the law am dead. He said, I through the law am dead to the law. If you don't know that tidbit, remember, hold that always in your back pocket. There's the law of sin and the law of the law of sin and the law of the Spirit. So you have to figure out what law. Is he saying I through the law of sin am dead to the law of the Spirit? Well, no, because he just said Christ is not the minister to sin. So he says, I through the law of the Spirit am dead to the law of sin, the law of our flesh, right? Not just because our flesh, so it doesn't matter what you are. No, I'm dead to the law of the flesh, meaning you're trying to turn the law into whatever you want it to be. Therefore, he might live unto Elohim. Now he's freed up to live unto Elohim, as Romans chapter 6, verse 22 would tell us. Verse 20, I am crucified. When Christ was crucified, why was Christ's crucifixion? Why does Christ's crucifixion even matter? Why does Christ's crucifixion matter so much? It matters because he followed the law. And are we supposed to pick up our Christ and be living sacrifices and crucify the flesh daily? Yes. I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, right? So what I live when I'm alive, the physical me you see, I live by the faith of the Son of Elohim who loved me and gave himself for me. So in my flesh, in my normal life, in my blood, in my veins and stuff like that, who you see is only valid and validated because of who Christ is in me, right? And what he did for me. All right? Who loved me and gave himself for me. So verse 21, Paul says, therefore, because of all this, I do not frustrate the grace of Elohim, or I do not get frustrated, I do not allow confusion when it comes to who the Most High is. Remember, grace, kan avra, or in the Greek, it is charis, right? Meaning who the Most High is and being inside of him and him being inside of you. He says, I don't allow that to ever dissipate. I do not allow for our connection to ever be split. Why? For if righteousness, for if right lawful standing come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Once again, what law are we talking about? He just said the law. If we know the context, the law of the Spirit, right, has helped the law, helped him to die to the law of the flesh, that he might live unto Elohim, right? Because of the sacrifice of Christ, who died because he followed the law. The only reason he could even be, not the only, but the main reason, right? The reason that he could be a sacrifice, let's put it like this, the reason Christ could be a sacrifice for us, and we could be a sacrifice for one another, is because Christ, right, was innocent. He followed the law. He never sinned. Verse 21, I do not frustrate the grace of Elohim, for if right lawful standing or righteousness come by the law of the flesh, the law of sin, then Christ is dead in vain. All right. He's using that as an opportunity to get to the point. What was the point? Once again, the point of the exercise, the point of the letter was, hey, I'm hearing that you guys have gotten away from what we preach. You need to live by and preach only what we taught you, seeing how you can't be trusted to make sure you're studying or make sure you're not involving other cultures. We need you to get back to the law. I'm here to tell you about even the same thing that I preach is what is being preached to the Hebrews. It's the same message. It hasn't changed. There's not a New Testament. You got outside of it. And I'm telling you, this even is something I had to deal with even with Peter, because Peter was so jacked up that Peter would treat you with respect, or persons like you with respect, until he thought that men were around. But see, we can't do that. We're supposed to be apostles or leaders or missionaries who are called specifically to make sure that we are not worried about men and led by men, but we are led by Christ and Christ alone. And so therefore, I need you to comprehend that you need to get away from the law of the flesh, right? Be in the law, which was originally the law of the Spirit, the way it was untouched, the way it was natural, the way it was holistically, the way it was unadulterated, the way it was when it was pure. Get back into the original law, right? He's given an example to the Galatians who have started wilding out, right? He's in essence Moses going up to the mountaintop talking to Yah, getting the law, and then hearing that, hey, the persons that we've been using this law to help, or the person that this law is going to help, Aaron has allowed them to go ahead and build a golden calf, and they out there wilding out. It's in essence the same thing, right? Does it mean therefore that the law that Moses is holding in his hand is a bad thing? No. It means that what Moses has in his hands, they need it more than ever. And what Moses preached to them, they're already being disobedient. He'll even break the tablets in anger. And then guess what Yah has to do? Come back up here and get the law again, boy. Right? I had the law for you. You to mess it up, come back, get it again, and then go down there and try again. Right? So we have to know the difference. When you know the law of the flesh, the law of the Spirit versus the law of sin, and we stop putting our flesh on it and let Yah's law be his law, it makes more sense. The context is there. It could be confusing. I get it. Prayerfully, it makes some sense, or at least brings you closer. If you have questions, by the way, during the series and stuff, let us know. But tonight, I have to put it at an end. We're already over time by about 10 to 15 minutes. We had to get ready for our project management meeting tonight. It'll be brief, but prayerfully that makes sense, or at least helps you make more sense out of it. I always tell you that if you can get that Romans, that's why we do the Roman road as often as we do. Once you get that, you recognize what Paul has been saying the whole time. Romans is towards the end of his life. Galatians is written earlier than Romans. So when you talk about Romans, you're talking about he's telling you what the real deal is in a very mature way to where you can't really dismiss what he's saying. But if you're only reading Galatians in one verse, some of us are only reading a few verses here or there, but if you're only reading one letter and being like, okay, this is what he meant, but you don't realize the context of the whole, it misses, right? It misses the mark. All right. So anyways, love y'all much. I thank you. Tada. I appreciate you. We will see you guys tomorrow. We'll be on live tomorrow. I will not be doing anything else past the live other than we'll do the special watch party we talked about for the Mormonism thing. But we'll go ahead and we'll see you guys tomorrow. If we don't see you tonight for the meeting, and thank you to all for being on today. We give our honor and praise to the Most High. We give our honor and praise to him for my wife, the Honorable Maya. And to the moderators, Minister Seth, SOC, Lottie Diner, everybody appreciate you. Tav, and as always, remember that you're loved, you're necessary, you are majestic, you're fearfully and wonderfully made, and you, which is all of us working together, will be the reason why people who are in this system no longer have to be of it. Shalom, take care. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.